Welcome to our lecture on monetary history. I am going to hit the highlights in this lecture to demonstrate how our money has changed over time. This lecture will focus on monetary history with a spotlight on the US dollar. The reason I am focusing on the dollar is because it is the international reserve currency, and as such it is used in far more transactions around the world than any other currency. The entire global financial system is currently based on US dollars, so it is prudent to observe monetary history from a dollar-centric perspective. So let's start with the birth of the US dollar in 1792. The United States Coinage Act defined the US dollar as 371.25 grains of pure silver. While this may seem arbitrary out of context, the primary currency used at that time was the Spanish silver dollar, which was a coin consisting of 371.25 grains of pure silver. So the US dollar was based on the Spanish silver dollar, already widely in circulation. The Coinage Act created the US Mint, which began to mint both silver and gold coins based on this measurement. Private banks issued paper money 100% redeemable in precious metals during this time period as well. All transactions were settled in gold and silver coins and the private banknotes backed by gold and silver. There were experiments with central banking and a national banking system over the course of the next 100 years or so, but both gold and silver were used as money during this time period. The U.S. officially went on the classical gold standard in 1900, and the Gold Standard Act defined the U.S. dollar as 25.8 grains of gold, 9/10 fine. This was a shift away from silver, and most transactions were settled in gold coins and private banknotes backed by gold. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and all banks were prohibited from issuing private banknotes thereafter. The Fed began issuing Federal Reserve notes, which were paper money that was 100% redeemable in gold. On the gold standard, all international payments were settled in gold bullion, and domestically, individuals were free to trade their Federal Reserve notes in for gold coins at any time. So gold coins were still used in transactions to a large degree during this time period. 20 years later, however, in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order suspending domestic gold convertibility and criminalizing private gold ownership. All Americans were required by law to deliver all gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at $20.67 per ounce of gold. Violators were subject to fines and imprisonment. Now, we won't go into the political ramifications of this, but for our purposes, this removed gold from domestic transactions. Americans now could only use paper dollars, but foreign central banks could still redeem Federal Reserve notes for gold bullion. The world wars effectively wrecked the classical gold standard because the combatants were forced to suspend trade settlement in gold, and they resorted to inflating their money supply to finance the wars. There was a half-hearted attempt to return to the gold standard after the wars were over, but necessary economic corrections were not politically feasible, so the classical gold standard was never re-implemented. So, in 1944, representatives from 44 nations of the world met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss a new global monetary system needed to replace the classical gold standard. The agreed-upon Bretton Woods system established the U.S. dollar as the international reserve currency. Under this agreement, the U.S. dollar replaced gold as the medium for international trade settlement. This meant that all international goods would be bought and sold in U.S. dollars, no matter which nations were doing the buying and selling. The dollar would remain pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and other nations could redeem their dollars for gold through the gold window. So in other words, the dollar was tied to gold, and all other currencies were tied to the dollar. Thus, all currencies were tied to gold through the dollar. This system bestowed an enormous privilege on the United States, as it created a global demand for dollars. The U.S. took advantage of this global demand for dollars by ramping up domestic spending on President Johnson's Great Society programs and ramping up military spending on the wars in Korea and Vietnam. To finance the increased expenditures, the U.S. government issued debt and ran trade deficits. Now, under the classical gold standard, this would have resulted in gold flowing out of the U.S. Treasury and to its creditors. Under Bretton Woods, however, the U.S. government could simply print new dollars and send them overseas. Eventually, other nations began to fear that the excessive spending and currency inflation in the U.S. would lead to a revaluation of the dollar to gold. The dollar was still pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, but there were a lot more dollars now in existence, so foreign nations began to increasingly exchange dollars for gold through the gold window. This eventually prompted the Gold Reserve Requirements Elimination Act, which was signed by President Johnson in 1968. This legislation eliminated the requirement that 25% of all Federal Reserve notes be backed by gold in reserves. This was done because gold was rapidly flowing out of the U.S. through the gold window. So in 1971, President Nixon issued an executive order unilaterally closing the gold window. This completely severed the dollar's link to gold, which in turn completely removed gold from the international monetary system. From that point forward, the US dollar and all other currencies became 100% fiat currencies backed only by the full faith and credit of the issuing government. Now, the US dollar has remained the international reserve currency, even with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, largely because Saudi Arabia and later OPEC agreed to keep oil priced exclusively in US dollars. This kept the global demand for dollars high because all other nations still needed to hold dollars in order to buy oil. So the world has been on a 100% fiat monetary system since 1971, with all ties to commodity money removed. This has removed all constraints on monetary inflation, and we have witnessed all developed countries expand their money supply massively over the past 4 decades. We're going to analyze the results of this in the next lecture, looking specifically at how it is relevant for us today. Before we do so, take a look at these 2 paper dollars. The first is a silver certificate issued between 1929 and 1934. Notice how it says that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States 1 silver dollar payable to the bearer on demand. This note makes it clear that the item of value is the silver dollar deposited with the Treasury, for which the note is simply a claim check. The second paper dollar is a current Federal Reserve note. This note clearly states that it is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and its denomination is $1. Notice how this implies that the note itself is the item of value. A side-by-side comparison clearly demonstrates how much our money has changed over time. Okay, so I hope the big picture is starting to take shape in your mind. In the next lecture, we'll analyze how all this is relevant for us today.